The collapse of a financial empire doesn't sound like an explosion. It sounds like the scratching of a fountain pen in a quiet room in Basel. In 1968, when the British pound finally surrendered its crown, there were no riots in London, no red flashing lights on trading floors. It ended with a signature at the Bank for International Settlements. They didn't call it a crash, they called it a managed retreat. Today, the internet is screaming about the death of the dollar, waiting for a cinematic moment of destruction. But history laughs at that expectation. Power doesn't break with the noise. It dissolves like sugar in water, silent, invisible, and irreversible. We are standing in 2026, and the ledger is being rewritten once again. If you listen closely to the silence in the global markets right now, you might just hear that pen scratching. By 1945, the British treasury was effectively empty. The factories were bombed, the debts were astronomical, and the empire was dissolving. By every rule of the free market, the British pound should have collapsed immediately. It didn't. Instead, it remained a global reserve currency for another 30 years. This wasn't a miracle of economics. It was a miracle of manipulation. To understand why, you have to look inside the Bank for International Settlements in Basel. The central bankers of the G10 nations faced a terrifying problem. They weren't afraid for Britain, they were afraid for themselves. They held massive amounts of sterling in their own reserves. If the pound collapsed, it would blow a hole in the balance sheets of France, Germany, and Switzerland. The creditors were trapped by the weakness of their debtor, so they formed what history calls the group arrangements. They extended massive credit lines to London, not to save the British economy, but to bribe it to stay standing. In 1968, they went even further with the sterling agreements. As smaller nations began to panic and sell their sterling, the system stepped in with a guarantee. The deal was simple. If you promise not to sell your pounds, we will guarantee their value in US dollars. Think about the cold logic of that mechanism. They were using the credit card of the new empire to pay the minimum balance on the credit card of the old empire. It is the logic of a hostage situation disguised as banking. You lend a bankrupt debtor more money, not because you trust him, but because his bankruptcy would destroy your own quarterly report. They called it a managed retreat. But managed for whom? For 3 decades, the official narrative remained calm, while the insiders slowly diversified their portfolios. The group arrangements bought them time to exit the burning building, one quiet transaction at a time. Meanwhile, the public, the pension funds, the small savers, the believers in the strong pound, were left holding paper that was slowly bleeding value. They kept the patient alive on life support just long enough for the doctors to leave the room. The British pound was the first test subject for this kind of zombie economics. It proved that with enough backroom handshakes you can defy gravity for decades. But the pound was just the prototype. The system that replaced it, the one you use today, took that mechanism and built it into a global engine of perpetual debt. Every 4 years, a politician stands behind a podium and promises to pay down the national debt. It sounds responsible, it sounds moral. It is also the single greatest lie in modern economics. Not because they won't do it, but because they cannot do it. If the United States actually paid off its debt, if it balanced its books tomorrow, the global economy would freeze instantly. To understand why, you have to understand the paradox that governs your life. In the 1960s, an economist named Robert Triffin noticed a fatal flaw in the design of the world reserve currency. The logic is terrifyingly simple. To provide the world with enough money to trade oil, steel, and technology, the issuer of the reserve currency must push money out of its borders. The United States must run a perpetual trade deficit. It must buy more than it sells. It must print more than it earns. Think of the deficit not as financial mismanagement, but as a global supply chain service. The world is hungry for dollars to conduct trade. The only way the US can feed that hunger is by running a tab. If the US stops printing, global liquidity dries up, and the world enters a depression. So the debt crisis that news anchors scream about isn't a bug in the software. It is the operating system. Look at the brilliance of this arrangement from the perspective of power. It allows the empire to export inflation and import hard assets. We send out pieces of cotton blend paper with green ink. In return, the world sends us German cars, Saudi oil, and Chinese electronics. It is the greatest trade deal in human history, as long as you are the one holding the printing press. The rest of the world works to produce real things. The United States works to produce the currency to buy them. But Robert Triffin saw the end of this movie too. He warned that there is a mathematical limit to this game. To keep the world liquid, you have to flood it with dollars. But by flooding the world with dollars, you destroy confidence in the value of the dollar itself. You are forcing your creditors, the nations producing the actual goods, to store their wealth in a vessel that is constantly leaking. For decades, the world accepted this leakage as the price of doing business. It was the fee for accessing the American market. But the laws of financial physics are absolute. You can print currency, but you cannot print trust. And when the creditors realize they are trapped in a game where the house always devalues their chips, they stop looking for a better seat at the table and start looking for the exit. The system works beautifully, right until the moment the privilege stops being a tool of trade and starts being used as something much more aggressive. For centuries, the unspoken contract of high finance was absolute neutrality. The vault does not care about your politics. The ledger does not care about your borders. It only cares about your solvency. You deposit gold, you get a receipt. It was a cold, indifferent system, and that indifference was exactly why the world trusted it. That contract was shredded in early 2022. It wasn't a market crash, it was a philosophical assassination. When the Western powers froze the central bank reserves of a G20 nation, a shockwave hit every capital city from Riyadh to Beijing. The public saw a political sanction, but the financial elite saw something far more terrifying, a breach of contract. We are not talking about seizing the yachts of billionaires. We are talking about sovereign wealth, the national savings of a country. In a single weekend, the United States dollar ceased to be a global public utility, like neutral water or electricity. It transformed into a digital leash. The mechanism was brutal in its efficiency. One day a nation has hundreds of billions in savings. The next day the screen still shows the numbers, but the access is gone. The password has been changed by the landlord. This was the moment the exorbitant privilege was weaponized. Every finance minister in the global south looked at their own balance sheets and realized the terrifying truth. These are not my assets. These are unsecured IOUs that Washington can cancel if they dislike my foreign policy. The dollar instantly shifted from being the world's risk-free asset into a return-free risk. If you align with the rules, you get your small interest payment. If you deviate, you lose the principal. There is a dark, dry irony here. The United States spent 70 years building a reputation as the safe haven of the world, the one place where property rights were sacred. Then, to win a geopolitical argument, they broke the most fundamental rule of banking. You never touch the depositor's money. You cannot be the global police officer and the neutral global banker at the same time. A police officer carries a weapon. A banker carries a trust. History is very clear on this point. When the banker pulls out a gun and points it at a customer, the other customers in the lobby don't start an argument. They don't scream, they just quietly check their balances, pack their bags and look for a different exit. And that is exactly what started happening while the news cycle was distracted. The trust was broken, and trust is the only thing that cannot be printed back into existence. When the front door of the global financial system becomes a security checkpoint, the smartest money stops walking through it. Instead, they start digging, and what they are building underneath the foundations of the old world is not just an escape route, it is an entirely new plumbing system. While the media debates the daily price of Bitcoin, the real revolution is happening in a place much more boring and much more dangerous, the plumbing of the global banking system. This revolution is not being televised. It is being written in lines of code in server rooms that Wall Street cannot access and cannot control. For 50 years, the financial geography of the world was shaped like a wheel, with New York City as the hub. If a company in Bangkok wanted to pay a supplier in Dubai, that money didn't fly straight across the Indian Ocean. It had to travel digitally to a correspondent bank in Manhattan, get stamped, pay a fee, and receive clearance from US regulators before traveling to the Middle East. That layover in New York was the choke point. It was the moment the empire could say no. But that geometry is being deleted. Look at the Mare Bridge project and the expansion of CPS. These are not just software updates, they are bypass surgeries for the global economy. Now, utilizing these new digital corridors, Thailand can settle transactions with the UAE directly. The money teleports from one jurisdiction to another without ever touching a US server, without paying a US fee, and most importantly, without requiring US permission. There is a dry irony here regarding SWIFT. For decades, the West treated SWIFT like a sophisticated public service. In reality, it was just an expensive toll booth on the only highway in town. It was slow, the fees were high, and the operator could lower the gate whenever he disliked your license plate. So the market did what the market always does. It paved a new road through the forest. It is faster, it is cheaper, and the toll collector doesn't even know the cars are passing. This is the true erosion of power. The strength of the dollar wasn't just about purchasing power, it was about surveillance. When money moves through New York, Washington sees it. When money moves through these invisible tunnels, the empire doesn't lose its military might, it loses its eyesight. It goes blind to the flow of global capital. But here is the catch. They have built the tunnels, they have laid the sophisticated fiber optic pipes. But a pipe is useless if it is empty. You still need to put something valuable inside it to settle the debt. And digital code, no matter how encrypted, is still just a promise. That is why, as they build the future of technology, they are looking back to the ancient past for the only asset that requires no promises at all. For 50 years, the global financial machine has run on a single, fragile fuel source: the promise. We call it fiat. It is the belief that a piece of paper is valuable simply because a government says it is. But when promises are broken often enough, the market stops listening to the words and starts looking for the weight. We are witnessing the end of the era of the promise, and the return to the era of the atom. Look at the architecture of the new proposals rising from the East. The BRICS nations are discussing the unit, a mechanism that feels almost ancient in its logic. It is not backed by the full faith and credit of a politician. It is backed 40% by physical gold and 60% by a basket of currencies. This is a profound philosophical shift. It is a declaration that trust in sovereign debt has failed, and only trust in collateral remains. The markets are already signaling this reality. When gold crossed the $5,000 per ounce mark in early 2026, the mainstream analysts called it a bubble. They talked about jewelry demand and supply chains. They missed the point entirely. Gold is not getting more expensive. The debt you use to buy it is getting worthless. The price chart of gold is just an inverted chart of the world's faith in the dollar. There is a magnificent dry irony in how the central bankers handle this metal. For decades, Western economists, the high priests of the fiat system, have sneered at gold. They called it a barbarous relic. They told you it yielded nothing. They mocked it. Yet if you look at the vault data from the last 3 years, the biggest buyers of this useless relic have been the central banks themselves. The hypocrisy is almost elegant in its audacity. They advise the public to hold paper assets that they can inflate at will, while they quietly accumulate the only asset that cannot be printed. They sell you the illusion of stability, while they hoard the insurance against its collapse. The rule of the elite has always been simple: watch what they vault, not what they preach. The transition is undeniable. The world is moving away from money that is owed to money that is owned. But physical atoms are heavy. Gold is slow. It sits in a vault and gathers dust. To make this heavy collateral move at the speed of the modern internet, you cannot rely on ships and armored trucks. You need a mind that can manage the complexity without human error, and that is where the most dangerous variable enters the equation. The nightmare of the 20th century banker was the queue outside the front door, the angry mob demanding their cash. The nightmare of the 21st century banker is much quieter. It is the sudden synchronized silence of the server room. The old masters of finance feared the panic of the crowd. The new masters fear the consensus of the code. To understand why, you have to look at what is replacing the human trader. Banks are currently deploying agentic AI systems that promise a 30% boost in productivity. These are not just calculators. They are autonomous decision makers, designed to optimize credit risk and execute trades. They don't sleep, they don't panic, and they don't have loyalty. They are the perfect rational actors. But there is a fatal flaw in this perfection, buried in the risk reports of the Bank of England. They call it herding. When 10,000 AI models are trained on the same datasets and run on the same cloud infrastructure, they cease to be independent thinkers. They become a single, terrified hive mind. When a human trader sees a market dip, he might hesitate. He might call his boss. He might feel a surge of patriotism, or hope that keeps him from selling. The algorithm feels nothing. It simply calculates probability. If the model says sell, 1,000 banks sell at the exact same millisecond. There is no buyer on the other side, because the buyer's algorithm also decided to sell. We spent billions building artificial intelligence to eliminate human emotion from the market, believing it would make the system stable. We succeeded. We removed the emotion, and in doing so we removed the only thing that ever slowed a crash down: doubt. We built a machine to correct human error, and the machine discovered that the biggest risk to the system is US. The next financial crisis will not unfold over weeks or days. It will not give you time to queue at the ATM. It will begin and end in the time it takes a processor to cycle. The wealth won't just move, it will evaporate before you even receive the push notification. And when the digital dust settles from that instant flash, the landscape that remains will look nothing like the unified global economy you grew up in. The most dangerous question being asked in investment circles right now is which currency will replace the dollar. It is a dangerous question because it creates a false comfort. It assumes that the throne will simply pass from one king to another, that the world will remain unified, just under a different flag. That is not what is happening. The throne is not being transferred, it is being burned. We are not moving toward a new global standard, we are moving toward a fragmented reality, a multipolar ledger. In this new map, the West will likely cling to the dollar. The emerging economies of the East will settle trade in gold and the unit. The unit and other nations will lock their citizens inside the digital walled gardens of CBDCs. There will no longer be a universal language of value. For 30 years, we were spoiled by the lazy convenience of globalization. It was efficient, it was fast, and it was singular. We foolishly believed that this unified world was the permanent destination of history. In reality, it was just a brief, abnormal vacation. And the vacation is over. We are trading the convenience of one ring to rule them all for the chaotic freedom of a fractured world. This fragmentation brings a profound irony. The globalists promised that a connected world would be too profitable to break. They were wrong. The very connections they built became the vulnerabilities that nations are now rushing to sever. We are returning to the historical norm, a messy, friction-filled world of competing empires and incompatible systems. You are currently standing on the bridge between these two eras, and as any historian can tell you, the danger is rarely found in the old world or the new world. The danger is always found on the bridge itself. The transition is where the wealth is lost, and where the unprepared are swept away. Let's return for a moment to that quiet room in Basel. The British Empire didn't turn off the lights instantly. It faded out slowly, while the orchestra was still playing the national anthem. Most people kept dancing, unaware that the floor beneath them had already changed owners. The financial architecture you rely on today was not built to protect your wealth through this transition. It was built to preserve the status quo for those who designed it. It is a system engineered to keep the music playing, even as the walls begin to crack. You cannot stop the agentic AI. You cannot stop the debt spiral. You cannot stop the tectonic shift of nations. But you possess the only power that matters, the right to choose your ledger. You must decide where to store the energy of your life's work. Do you trust the paper promise of a government that must inflate to survive? Or do you trust the cold, unyielding certainty of mathematics and matter? The choice is yours. But understand this, in a shifting world, neutrality is not safety. It is surrender. History never stops. It is simply waiting for you to turn the page. If you want to decode the next chapter before it is written, leave a 1 in the comments. Subscribe to Financial Money History, because the only thing more expensive than knowledge is ignorance.